Hey everybody, my name is Derek Osgood. I'm the founder of Ignition, and we're joined here today by Maureen West, who's the Director of Product Marketing at Cytel. Maureen, do you want to give a quick intro on yourself? We're going to talk a whole bunch about GTM today, so excited to dig in.
Yeah, I love this topic. I have been product marketer for, I don't know, a long time, over 10 years. And I have watched product marketing evolve, and I can't wait to talk about, tools for product marketers, which is a relatively new thing, pretty exciting, and how, we can talk about a very important yet completely sidelined process like go to market or product commercialization or product launch, whatever flavor you want to call it. I'm here to talk about it.
Love it, love it. Yeah, I mean, you got a ton of experience, running go-to-market processes, and I know that like we've worked a bunch. You came and we actually met over intercom when you signed up for Ignition. So I mean, give me the quick rundown on like how tell everybody about how we met and how you found us.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw something about Ignition on a very early LinkedIn post, and I had been on the receiving end of you're going to use Asana to manage all of your projects and launches. And I'm like, oh God, no, please, not another project management tool to try to do something that is highly strategic and requires a lot of conversations and a lot of documents and decisions in a project management tool. So I was scrolling through, and I'm always looking for new technology, but I saw, a post on Ignition that says the first GTM ops platform. I'm like, game on. Those are fighting words. Now I'm going to see exactly what this team is made of. And I was pleasantly surprised when I popped over to the website and I saw, oh, this is way more than project management. This has all the things that I need to plan my programs, put in the details of a launch, and then do things like easily communicate the status of the launch to stakeholders or executives. So I thought, okay, big win. And I think I signed up immediately, right on the spot. And that was it. That was it. It was like love at first sight.
Love at first sight. Well, it's always great to hear that we're doing something right on that end, and definitely like I think we'll talk about this more as we get a little bit deeper in here. But like part of why we started Ignition was obviously because project management tools, like I have been in that seat as well, and like having to stitch this stuff together in tools that are basically just built for managing tasks. And go to market is a much more strategic exercise that involves research, a bunch of strategic planning documentation. It's got asset management components to it. And so, I think like I'm glad that you were looking for something different and looking to level that up, and you managed to find us along the way. But I mean, like, I think a lot of this, like companies that just tend to not be very good at launching stuff. And this is a problem. I've seen it now talking to, thousands of companies in every possible industry you can think of, from tech to pharma to CPG to, fashion and entertainment. And so like, why do you think companies are so bad at launching stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I think it comes down to just underestimating the importance of a launch activity and underestimating the time it takes to get all the pieces in place. A launch, the day you announce a product or a new feature or a new innovation or paradigm shift or whatever you're announcing, that's day one of selling season. But it's like how a band becomes an overnight success and you're like, yeah, but we spent 10 years getting here. That's what launches. It's a long time to perfect and get there and make decisions on all the things that you want to do. And then launch day is the most outward expression of all the things that you've been practicing, and it can tell it's really the fate of your company's success or otherwise. But I think they just don't pay attention to how much time it really takes to plan, or that you can use launch to be really strategic to accomplish something in your business. They think, okay, well, I've got a new product, I just got to tell the market. Yeah, you do. That's great. But what about the product is really going to, get people to want to learn more? We're all busy, and you're basically asking people, your audience, to stop what they're doing, to listen or read anything about your announcement, and then understand it, synthesize it, and figure out how it fits into their day, especially if they're not your customers. And if they already are your customers, you have to make sure that that content is immediately understandable by your customers. And if it's not, then your customers are going to say, wait a minute, is this for me? Are they changing direction? I don't really know about it. Did I miss something? So it's really important to, use this opportunity to connect with your audience, understand what you're putting out into the market, and make sure it's worth your audience's while to learn more about it. And if companies go into the planning process with that in mind, I think the outcome might be a little different. And I think you might see fewer, better launches, which, that could be okay. There's a lot of technology out there, and there's a lot of noise as well.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think like one of the things that you talked about a bunch when we were kind of just prepping for this was the fact that like launch is almost like kind of the wrong terminology to think about when you're talking about launching, right? Yeah. It's launch day in most people's minds, and it's like, okay, what is the announcement that we're making to tell the world that this thing exists? But like the launch process and like what launch is really about is, I think you've used the terminology, it's the commercialization process. And it's like not about the launch process is much less about like how do you actually prep for the announcement of the thing, and much more about how are you laying the kind of strategic groundwork that ends up indicating how you actually sell the thing and how you can communicate it to customers over a much longer time horizon. And like launch day is sort of, I think you've used the term, it's like it's just the first day of selling, and from then on, like everything else is all just using all that work that you did during the launch process to create the collateral that you need to establish your positioning messaging, to identify like how you're going to package and sell the product. And so launch day is just taking that and initiating, putting it into action, but then you're using it forever. It's like the launch process never ends. It's right. You're doing a bunch of front-loaded planning to support that product over a much longer period of time, right?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point that you can reuse these assets that you're creating. So you should create really good assets at the start, so you don't have to recreate them. And now I will say that you will have to update them periodically because they're not evergreen. Things change and markets change and so on. But you should, do your homework to know your audience. Why is it important for them to listen to this message, or how are they going to bring it into their daily life? And if software was more like a consumer product, like a hard product that you put on a shelf, I think people would take a lot longer to identify their audience, really shape a profile of the perfect person who's going to not only, pick it up off the shelf, but use it for long term. And I think, everyone talks about their ICP and personas, but they kind of stop short at understanding how that person, what that person does every day, and really understanding what the process is inside a company, or how those processes can vary from company to company, not only from, small to mid to enterprise, but from US to Europe or APAC, from West Coast to East Coast. Like all of these things matter. And I hate this word, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's very nuanced when you're talking about people and how they do things. You have to get inside their brain to help them understand how to use a product. And that's the work that product marketers and product managers and marketers and services people and customer success people need to take into account when they are interacting with their customers. And that that sounds daunting, and it should be daunting, in, at first, because you have to learn about these things. But as you get to know your customers really well, you begin to collect this information, and it just becomes part of your fabric of your company. But definitely worth the time to do that, because then things like launch go much smoother, because you already have all this knowledge about the market, about your customers, about what makes them happy, about what makes them want to use your product. And I think that's really what goes into those assets, that you can't really put a line item on a spreadsheet that says, get to know your customer.
Yep.
Okay, well, how long should that take?
Yep.
5 years, 2 years, 2 weeks, 2 months? What is that? So I
Yeah.
think that's the hard part about it. It's all the research that goes into it. And then if you talk about like decision makers and approvers within the company, as a product marketer, you have to position the launch, and you have to bring this information to stakeholders, because you have to gain budget, especially if it's a big announcement. And you have to explain it to them, like, this is what we're going to do, and this is why it's worth the outlay of cash, and this is what we think we're going to, recoup when we do this. So I think there's a business aspect to it, there's a customer aspect to it, there's the the messaging aspect to it. It's multifaceted and really complex. But also, like, the best part of my job is that I get to be in all of these things and make all these decisions, or at least make recommendations to get decisions made about how to proceed. I think it's worth it, but definitely complex.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I mean, you bring up two interesting points there. Like, one, this has been a gripe of mine for a very long time with the way that software companies launch things, which is, like they because software companies pride themselves on being iterative and shipping things and then continuing to improve them over time, it's very common for them to like treat the launch as less important, because they're like, oh, we're going to update it down the road. But the thing that they don't realize is that like launch is a good forcing function for actually rallying all those resources internally to support the creation of that new thing. And so when you treat it as unimportant and you're just going to iterate later, oftentimes like those assets that you create never get updated. They'll get updated, but they will never actually be created to the fidelity that you actually should be creating them in the first place, because suddenly like you can't get design resourcing prioritized around it. You can't get, the product team is shipping things too quickly, and you're not actually able to like get the resources that you need on that side. So, I think like it's often important for companies to recognize that like getting it right the first time actually is very important, because you don't ever actually pay attention enough to get it right the second time. So if you're 80% good, like you're fine. But, if you're 50% good, then you're in trouble, because you're probably never going to get it even to 80% with that like ongoing iteration. So
yeah, that's a great point. And I think, to add on to that, I personally, I mean, I know Agile is the hot software development process of the day, but it's really hard on customers, and especially if they release frequently. It's overwhelming to customers, and then it's overwhelming to your product marketing and marketing team to keep up with that. And this idea that you have to, ship your product the second it's ready is a fallacy. You have to ship your product when you have enough of a story to tell the market. And I think that's this kind of a liberating way to think about product launch, in terms of development and the story you're telling, because now you can amass a theme, or you can amass features that build up to a theme, or that make sense to the market. Or now you've had 4 sprints where you now have a full product or full feature to talk about. And if you talked about them independently, like you can't release product like a Netflix episode. It has to make sense in total. So you have to really just make sure that you're releasing at the right time.
Yeah. Well, and so structure of the story is one thing. The other point that you brought up was like the importance of kind of internal marketing. And I think that that's an area that like companies oftentimes forget about and under index on. And it's probably the most important part, honestly, of like launch success, because there's so many different teams that have competing priorities. getting them kind of aligned around that is the only way that you actually make sure that that launch goes off effectively. So I'm curious, like, when you think about kind of structuring the go-to-market process and structuring commercialization, like, what do you feel like are kind of the biggest considerations that companies should be taking into account?
That launch is not a one-person job. It's not up to the product marketer to strategize, build the plan, execute the plan, launch the product, and then see it, for a quarter out. You need a team to do this. And, in SaaS companies, everything is interdependent. And so your launch team should be a cross section of the most important aspects of the commercialization of a product. So when you think about that, who are those people? It's, of course, the product manager and the product marketer, of course, but it's also your sales enablement person, because they're going to be responsible for telling the sales team how to fit this into their talk track on a day-to-day basis. It includes the finance person, because you want to know what the financial targets are. And that person has to also say, or ask the questions, and the product marketer should be asking the question too, does this fit our pricing models? Or in the case that it doesn't, the financial person has to say, well, we can make another way to, we can make another pricing model, and this is how it's going to work. But you need to do that kind of early too. Mm. So you need the services people as well, because they need to understand the ins and outs of how to implement something. So they have to get very technical, and the earlier they can understand how to implement a product, the better off they are. Support has to do the same thing. They have to understand how to diagnose and triage and resolve this issue. So that they're a very important part of your launch team. Then, of course, marketing has to be involved, because they're going to help you be the outward expression of your launch. So, there's a cross-functional team that has to be on board in order to do that. So that's like part one, create a team. Part two is launch. At launch as a process isn't difficult. You have to decide what you're launching, why it's important, what are the assets you're going to create, and then launch it on the day. But all of those things and all of the people around the table have different expectations of what it means to launch something into their department. Mm-hmm. So sales enablement is thinking about, okay, what kind of persona is this? Who are we targeting? That's a conversation that you have as part of the launch team, so that they can easily go back and convey that to sales. Is it a new persona? If it's a new persona, there's a heavier lift in education, because you have to break down who that persona is and why you've introduced this new persona. Marketing needs to understand the positioning of this product and the message that you want to tell the market, but they really have to understand that. It's not something that you can just pass to them and say, okay, go and make a campaign based on this. There has to be a conversation about, okay, what is the goal of this launch? And, how do we want to implement our campaigns to achieve that goal? For example, is it a product adoption campaign, right? Or is it a wedging out competition campaign? Or is it going into a new market campaign? All of these things can be accomplished through launch, but you need to have that conversation ahead of time so that marketing can be aligned with you and tell you these are the kinds of things that work really well for this kind of objective. Mm-hmm. So your team is going to tell you exactly what they need for inputs so they can produce their assets and their outputs. They'll also tell you lead time. Lead time is really important. My least favorite thing to do, when it's done to me, I really get angry, but I would never do it to another person, is, bring a plate of stuff to them and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And we've got 2 weeks to do it. And they're looking at all of this stuff and they're like, there is no way. I need at least 3 emails. I need designs for this. Our designer is backed up. Like all these things that's happening on the marketing team that you have no insight into because it's not your team. And you just have to be aware that you can't dump something on another team and expect them to be done on a timeline that's right for you or the product team even. So getting lead times from your launch team not only makes your launch a more accurate period of time to prepare for, but you're remembering to treat your internal customers as human beings, and they've got insight that you need in order to be successful. So I think that's the other thing, you know, have a team, they're experts, let them voice their opinions and their expertise on things, and ask a lot of questions. That first kickoff meeting for a launch team should be, okay, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Okay, does it mean this? Or how technical is this? How different is it from what we're already doing today? It should be just a bunch of questions to get everyone on the same page and to have that understanding. So like definitely getting a team and getting them to say what they need in order to develop that process, like furthers you down the road to a product or process adoption rather.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different story, process adoption.
Well, we're going to cover that. We're going to cover that here in a sec. But I'm curious, like, you know, when you like, obviously there's a lot of moving parts that you just covered, and there's a lot of teams involved. Like, why do you think, you know, like teams kind of default to project management tools so often? And like, why do you think project management tools like really fail this? Because I think like every product marketer that I talk to, they all generally agree that like project management tools ultimately like just don't solve the problem, and they end up like actually just creating a bunch of like work about the work. But I'm curious like why you think it breaks down when like the primary way that you're managing this is like your checklist.
Exactly. So I have a like over my career, I've amassed 183 line checklist for launch. And you know, in my earlier years, people would ask me, you know, do you have a checklist that I can, you know, that's good for launch? I'm like, yeah, I have a checklist, and here it is. And the first thing they say is, that's really large. Do you have a smaller one? I'm like, no, because you have to take into consideration how your company operates. What are the internal machinations to get a product from the product team onto a contract and then into the market? But also the conversations that are happening in the meetings, they're not status updates. They're business decisions being made. And the only way to express a business decision is on a task. But the task level, if you don't understand what's behind it, you're just going to say, okay, great, you know, I have positioning, or I've identified my audience. Well, how did you identify the audience? What segmentation processes did you go through? Did you have a conversation with the product manager about the persona, or did the product manager like forget that there was a persona attached to this, which happens sometimes? But you have to ask these questions, and then you can't add that to a task list. These are just things that you have to learn about. As a product marketer, you have to be curious about these things. You have to know all the tasks and all the areas that you need to cover as your responsibility. And it just doesn't translate to Asana. I mean, even though you can do things like dependencies and Gantt charts and milestones and things like that, it just falls short because, let's face it, the only people who are going to go into Asana is the marketing team. Your sales team isn't going to go in there, or your sales enablement person isn't going to go in there and look at the task or look what's been done. They're going to go to the meeting, and then they're going to talk about it in the meeting, but they're never going to go into Asana. And the last thing you want to do in a meeting is bring up a project management tool and say, okay, let's check this off. That's boring, and it's not of any value. So when I was looking at Ignition and I saw things like, cost associated with this launch or financial targets, okay, we're serious now. This is a business process that we're talking about. This has business drivers behind it. We should treat it like a business function, and there are going to be costs associated with it. So what are we putting into it, and how do we recoup it? What are our targets? I thought that was pretty cool. And then, just all these different things about audience and persona, well, those, you can really detail that in there, or you can add slides in there so that other people can see it. But it's different. That the UI for Ignition is so much easier to understand than the UI for project management, because it's just lines, right? Just lines. And Ignition's like, oh, I've got different spaces I can go to look at different aspects of this launch, but it's really going to tell me the story of the launch planning as opposed to the output of the tasks. And I think that's really powerful. And what people need to understand is that there is a story behind the launch. What did your team decide, and why did your team decide these things? And you can put that all in Ignition. And I think that's really where the magic happens, when you're making decisions about the business, when you're making decisions about how to connect with your audience, when you're making it clear to the internal team why a product is important to a business person, because that's what we're doing. We're building tools for business people so they can do business things.
Yep.
So I mean, that's why I think project management tools fail, because they can't tell the story of business. They just tell the story of the task list.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, ultimately, like whenever I'm talking about go-to-market processes, like I always, say that, like, look, they're not projects. They're not like they're not a list of tasks that you need to complete. You have a checklist as part of it to make sure that you do all the things that you need to do. But what a go-to-market process is ultimately it's an internal enablement exercise, and that's a storytelling exercise. And so the important thing is like being able to structure that work that you are doing in a way that is intelligible to like all of these other disparate stakeholders that are not involved in that process nearly as directly as you are. And so like when you can structure the most beautiful template in the world in Asana, but like because it's your template, because it's just totally free form and it's just a bunch of tasks, like nobody else can actually understand what those things really mean. And so, that's part of why we actually built this out, like you mentioned, with like different modules for different components of the go-to-market planning process. But also, I think the other thing that you flagged is like, one important part is like, how are you actually surfacing context effectively to those teams? But then the second important part is, how are you also managing how you do those things, and how you actually, like, a checklist and a project management tool, like it's going to help you document and track everything that you're doing, but you're actually doing work at each of those tasks. And like those tasks are not just like, okay, I like looked at that task and said this is done, I'm now done with it. You actually are going and like doing legwork to go collect research, you're synthesizing it, you're running analysis, you're turning that into framework driven structures for how you're communicating that stuff. And like project management tools don't help you do any of that work. And so that's why teams end up stitching together all these different point solutions, which like they do help do some of that work. But then again, you run into the context problem where all the work that's done in them doesn't talk to each other. And so the information doesn't flow freely in the process. So that's definitely, I mean, like spot on why we kind of started Ignition, is to help you like actually do the work and automate more of that, but also help like flow that context downstream to all the teams that need it.
Yeah, and let's be clear, I'm not denigrating the marketing team. I'm denigrating the project management tools of marketing, the things that marketing has to work with. I don't even think it works for marketing, frankly, but they're forced to use those because spreadsheets are even more difficult to use, especially if you have to use Excel.
Yep. Well, so I mean, you mentioned earlier, like, getting adoption on a new process is always tough. And like, I think anybody who's tried to roll out any kind of new process, not just go to market, but like, even rolling out just, competitive intel processes, it's like, it's always tough getting cross-functional teams in like on the same page around that process, getting them to adopt it. I guess, like, how do you think about like rolling out, a new go-to-market process and like getting all those other teams on board, making sure that process is repeatable and useful to everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel for all the brand new product marketers or the solo product marketers who come, into a new company and they are expected to pull off a product launch within 6 months and have a process around it. It's difficult. And I think, when I think about the first time that I was in a position to define launch, I had started from a business analyst background. So I, had already understood all of my internal stakeholders in terms of what their business area functions were and what their objectives were. And once you have that information, like what really goes on in the sales enablement or the sales function, or what really goes on in the marketing function, and the various areas of the marketing function, right? It's creative, it's demand, it's content, it's customer marketing, like all of that. And then understanding services, implementation, and understanding support. Once you begin to see it from their angle, you really understand how disruptive a launch is to their daily work if you do it poorly. If you don't, get everyone on board by an internal training, and you launch something and customers call and nobody has any idea about it, well, that's a huge fail. And now, the person on the phone feels terrible because they don't know what the customer is talking about. And the customer's like, this person doesn't know what I'm talking about. Now I feel like I have lost trust in my company. So, the way that I do it is I try to really understand what the objectives are for each of my internal stakeholders, the people who are going to be on the launch team. And every time I have a conversation with a product manager or with a marketing person or with a salesperson, I'm always thinking about other people who are impacted by the work. So if I'm talking to sales, I think about, okay, marketing and product and services. If I'm talking to product, I'm thinking about all the other people. If I'm talking to finance, I'm thinking about, okay, what are the contracts going to look like? How is sales going to sell this? How much training do we need to do around a new contract or a new pricing model? So I become an advocate of my internal customers and really build trust with them that I have their best interests at heart, so that when we do launch and cause a disruption, because a launch, when you think about an actual rocket launch, that explosion at the end is exactly what happens in a company when you launch a new product. You do not want call volume to go up. So you need to do everything in your power to make sure call volume is just even, right? Or not at all. So step one is become, an advocate, an advisor, and just a trusted person who, the salespeople are going to say, okay, she's got it covered. I know that the team's going to be trained and they're going to have the assets that they need. Now, when you get the buy-in, so they've defined, what they need for launch, what the lead time is going to be, and then you actually put it into practice. As a product marketer doing this for the first time, have zero expectations. Like, don't expect that this will go smoothly, because it won't, and it shouldn't. If it does go smoothly, you should probably have a marketing or market announcement about how smoothly your launch went the first time, because that's amazing. But don't have expectations that you're going to do things really well. The thing you should focus on is always understanding why a product or feature is important to the audience. Make sure the messaging is spot on, and then you can start working on all the different pieces on enablement and marketing, et cetera. So I would say, and if you're working in a SaaS software company, you have a cadence of releases. So every release is going to be an opportunity to practice. It's like riding a bike. You got to figure out how to balance and how to turn and how to go fast and how to stop. And you fall down and you get up and you do it again. And it's just that simple. You don't have expectations, practice on something, get buy-in, that for this release, we're going to work on this process. Have postmortems after the launch. What did you guys think went really well? What did you guys think didn't go so well? And have open feedback, because your launch team has got to be a safe space where you can say, yeah, this was really crap, or we did really well. And then we can say, yeah, that was really good, or that was terrible. Let's not do that again. Why do you think that happened? And then you just have a conversation. But if you can create that space in a launch team where you're just talking about facts of what happened and just without blaming, then you really have the ability to, you're gaining trust, and everyone understands, oh, things are going to happen. It's not a problem. But what you'll begin to see happen is people will ask questions during the planning of the launch process. Hey, I don't really know what I should do about this. Who do you think I should talk to? Oh, great. I can set up a meeting with this person. Let's all talk about it. You know, as a product marketer, I always want to be in on a conversation so I can learn more and how to become more of an advocate to both parties. So I like to be in those meetings and hear things, because then I can ask additional questions, and the person who had the, you know, who was unsure now gets their question answered, and then that becomes part of the knowledge of the launch team. So I think that's really important, just to build up that camaraderie and that trust, and practice with each release.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, the postmortems and like retrospective process is like another area that I think teams like way too often forget about. And, you know, I think it's an area that like we built into Ignition. We have like retros that you can just pulse out directly after a launch to try and like capture that knowledge so that you can actually optimize down the road. I think so many companies, they fire and forget, and then they move on to the next thing, and they just don't do any kind of optimization around their process, and their process never gets better. It just ends up being broken forever. And you also mentioned a really interesting point, which is like, you know, some of these other counter metrics that like companies often don't think about, and like good product marketers, they do actually think about this stuff, is, you know, things like support volume as a metric to measure how effective that launch is. Like support volume is one of the best indicators of whether or not you launch that thing effectively, because you should theoretically see it go up a little bit, because that means that you've got the message in front of some people and they actually are using it. But then you hopefully don't have it just explode because you did a poor job of communicating how to use the thing and like what the thing is. So I guess like, how do you think about like when you're rolling these processes out, like how do you measure whether or not your go-to-market process that you've created and like spent all this time, you know, investing in building out across the team, like how do you measure not whether or not it's like successful and whether or not it's actually an effective process?
Yeah, you know, for years I have avoided this question, because I think I was building my own knowledge about how to effectively measure a process and effectively measure product marketing. So there's always the really lazy metric of, you know, revenue dollars, right? How much did you bring in according to, you know, whatever period of time? I think that's pretty lazy. But, you know, it might be the metric that you use for the first couple of launches as you are building the muscle. But, you know, I really think that product marketing and SaaS has changed from, you know, the early 2000s to today. Messaging changes much more frequently. You know, products are being launched every day all over the world. External factors are having a bigger play on us than ever before. And the idea that you can have these long-term metrics like revenue or, you know, customer satisfaction over long periods of time, those are just sort of not, they're lagging indicators. And you just really need to understand, I think, you know, how can you be more proactive as a product marketer to help your business solve business problems? And I think that's how product marketing has evolved. It used to be, we're going to help, you know, we're going to do positioning and messaging, and then we're going to launch products, and we're going to do enablement or help teams do enablement. Well, now I think a product marketer's role is to really unblock business problems. And you can do that pretty effectively with launches and enablement and new messaging, et cetera. So like, for example, let's say you had a launch and there was a new feature that was really important to the organization, but it didn't get the uptake that you thought it would. Well, that's not a reason just to like kind of ignore what happened. There's remediation opportunities, right? You can do product adoption pushes. Great. Well, who's the target audience for that? How are we going to measure that? What is, you know, by what metric adoption, how many percentage points or how many users do we need to have on this in order to keep retention rates up? So like product adoption can lead to retention and customer satisfaction, but there are little measures in between the big ones that I think are important for product marketers to pay attention to and can have real impact on. So I think if if as a product marketer, if you've become that advisor and you really understand your audience, your product, and how your business makes money, which are three really big things for a product marketer to understand, then you have an opportunity to use launch in a very strategic way that may or may not require a lot of money, but just requires creativity and specificity. And I think that's a newer way that I'm thinking about launch over the last several years, that it doesn't have to be this necessarily, you don't have to have a party, although those are a lot of fun. It doesn't have to be a big conference, a user conference where you're spending tons of money and asking people to come. No, it can be to your core users, and you can get them really excited because you've helped them understand a feature that is really important to them as well as the business.
Yep. Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I think like product marketing as like business unblocker is one of the better descriptions that I think I've heard thrown around to describe what product marketing does day in, day out. And like, that's why, like measuring product marketing is so hard, because it touches so many other metrics that are not necessarily directly owned by them, but it's also a function that is involved with a lot of like noisy metrics too. Like, revenue involves so many inputs that's not necessarily just your launch. But I tend to be a big fan of like using those, like revenue metrics and kind of the business metrics that you are trying to move ultimately, and looking at kind of like incrementality in those, and how, within that launch window, like how did you actually drive like specific lift in them. Obviously, not every launch is going to actually drive that, because some launches are, more incremental. Some launches are not necessarily like big enough that they're going to materially impact revenue. If it's a feature that's impacting retention, that may be, a very lagging indicator looking at, revenue over time. But I think, a bunch of good insights there, and I appreciate you jumping on today. This has been like an amazing chat, tons of great nuggets here around, how to build out these effective go-to-market processes, how to roll them out, how to get other teams on board. And, I think it's a challenge that every single company that I've talked to is facing, regardless of whether or not they have a product marketing team or don't have a product marketing team on board. And I think it's one that's also just only getting worse over the coming years, because like people are launching more stuff, it's harder to stand out, and the understanding of how to do it is like falling by the wayside. And so it's awesome that there's folks like you out there that have this expertise, and like you are able to actually roll this out, in an effective manner with the companies you're working with. So yeah, thank you again for joining. And what's the best way, if people want to keep in touch, where should they reach out?
Yeah, where should they reach out? I'm on LinkedIn. I don't post a lot, but I do interact with content, with posts. You can always find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. If you're a Pavilion member, I'm a part of Pavilion. I used to be on that place called Twitter, but I'm no longer on that place. So LinkedIn is probably the best. But thank you for having me on today. And I really love talking about this commercialization process. But I really love that product marketers now have tools to help them with this work. It's like I said, I think it's the best job around, because it's so complex and it is so intricate. But really, it's ultimately about connecting with customers and solving business problems, and that for me is worth the effort of a product launch and product marketing.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Maureen. And if any of you are looking for help with your launches, whether those are bigger product launches or smaller feature releases or even just campaigns, reach out to Ignition. We're at haveignition.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I similarly love to hear from folks. So yeah, thank you again, and appreciate the time.
Yeah, excellent.